In the history of Christian music, no one has ever done what Lecrae did.
And the winner goes to Lecrae.
We're with Lecrae, 4-time Grammy winner, 11-time Grammy nominee. He just found that out today. Today he's nominated for Best Contemporary Christian Music Performance and Song and Best Contemporary Christian Music Album.
Crazy.
But that success didn't come without some adversity. Growing up without a father, getting sexually abused as a child, dealing drugs at 16, and even once pointed a gun at a woman on the street just to feel something. But here's the part that almost nobody talks about. At the very peak of all that success, he almost walked away from everything. This is the story of how Lecrae Moore went from the streets of Houston to becoming Christian music's #1 rap artist. Lecrae Devon Moore was born on October 9th, 1979 in Houston, Texas, and from an early age, the odds were already stacked against him. Growing up, Lecrae's father had left when Lecrae was still a baby and became a drug addict, which left his mother Orr Melton having to raise Lecrae alone in a poor neighborhood in southern Houston. And unfortunately for Lecrae, the family would bounce around constantly. From Denver to San Diego, then Dallas, there was no place to truly call home, and no male role model in the house showing Lecrae who he was supposed to become. And unfortunately for Lecrae, it got worse before it got better. When Lecrae was around 7 or 8 years old, Lecrae was sexually abused by his babysitter. And that wound didn't just disappear, it left Lecrae with a deep anger that he would carry for years. An anger he didn't even have a name for, but that showed up in every bad decision Lecrae made from that point forward. By the time Lecrae was a teenager, without a father and without any real direction in his life, he had found his crowd, and they weren't exactly the best kind of influence on Lecrae. You see, by the age of 16, Lecrae was already drinking and using drugs while also dealing on the side to make some extra money. And through all of it, there was one thing he never left the house without, and that would be his grandmother's Bible. Not because he believed anything inside of it, but because he believed that it brought him luck. Almost like if he had it on him, nothing bad could happen to him. And that would all be true until Lecrae's actions finally caught up to him. While Lecrae was still in high school, an officer arrested Lecrae for drug possession. But when the officer found a Bible on his dashboard with highlighted verses, the officer gave Lecrae an ultimatum. Now, unfortunately for Lecrae, the turning point wasn't immediate, and sadly for him, things just weren't getting any better. As he went back to college at the University of North Texas, trying to live differently from his past, Lecrae got into a brutal car accident. The truck that Lecrae was in reportedly rolled and flipped multiple times with glass flying everywhere, and it was that moment that everything changed. From there, Lecrae started volunteering at a juvenile correction facility in Denton, Texas, where he'd rap for kids who had already caught charges, already been through the system, and already being written off as future criminals by everyone around them. And instead of showing up with the Bible and a sermon, Lecrae shared his raw and unfiltered story from someone who had stood in the exact same place that they were now standing. And for those kids, they felt every word of it. But what Lecrae didn't know was that this was an eye-opener not just for those kids, but also for himself, as he now understood why he was supposed to make music and what his true purpose was. In 2004, Lecrae and his business partner Ben Washer started their own independent label called Reach Records and dropped Lecrae's debut album, Real Talk. No major deal, no radio support, and no real industry connections. Just Lecrae with his unique story and a microphone. The album eventually hit number 29 on the Billboard Gospel chart after getting picked up by Cross Movement Records. And honestly, for two guys who built this from nothing, this was the exact type of momentum that they needed to keep on pushing. Then in 2008, Rebel became the first Christian hip-hop album to ever hit number 1 on the Billboard Gospel chart, something that nobody had ever done before. And each album after that just kept raising the ceiling. A Grammy nomination, a spot at the 2011 BET Hip Hop Awards, and then in 2013, a Grammy win for Best Gospel Album with Gravity, making Lecrae the first hip-hop artist in history to ever take home that award. but nobody could prepare Lecrae for what happened in 2014, when Anomaly debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200 with 88,000 copies sold in its first week, the first album ever to simultaneously top both the Billboard 200 and the Gospels Albums chart. The label he'd built from nothing had just done what nobody in Christian music had ever done. But here's where the story gets complicated. After Michael Brown was killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, something shifted in Lecrae that he just couldn't ignore anymore. And he started using his platform to speak openly about race, about what it actually meant to be a black man in America, about police brutality and a system that had been failing people who looked like him long before anyone was paying attention. And that decision, as honest and straightforward as it seemed to Lecrae, turned out to be the most expensive decision he ever made. Because the audience that had been buying his records for the better part of a decade, largely white evangelicals, did not want to hear any of it. And they made that very clear very fast. If you need proof beyond his word, the numbers tell the same story. Anomaly had sold 88,000 copies in its first week back in 2014, and when he dropped his next album in 2017, All Things Work Together, it sold somewhere between 20,000 and 23,000 copies, which meant in a single album cycle, Lecrae lost roughly 3/4 of the fan base he had spent 10 years building. The churches that once lined up to put Lecrae on their stages stopped calling, and the Christian radio stations that had made him a household name in evangelical circles pulled his music without a word. And the Washington Post, which had once celebrated him with the label evangelical mascot, had accidentally revealed the entire problem in just 2 words. Because the moment Lecrae stopped being a mascot and started being a man with his own opinions, the same institutions that had handed him a platform made it very clear they wanted it back on their terms. And then in early 2021, it got even more pointed when Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA, went online and tried to get Lecrae completely banned from churches after Lecrae performed at a rally supporting Georgia Senator Raphael Warnock, publicly accusing Lecrae of caring more about being accepted by what Charlie called the Democratic power establishment rather than standing up for truth. And while the very people who had once built Lecrae up were now trying to break him back down, Lecrae was privately fighting a battle much deeper and much more personal than nobody could see. By 2016, Lecrae was on a full-on crisis. The sexual abuse that Lecrae had never properly processed, the years of growing up without a father, the trauma from street life, it all started coming up in ways that Lecrae couldn't control or perform his way out of. No matter how many records he sold, Lecrae has talked about this openly in interviews and even wrote about it in detail in his 2020 book. Lecrae was at the very top of his career, but at the same time, his soul was falling apart quietly. Lecrae started questioning everything around him, not just the church systems, but Lecrae's own faith. And things got so bad that Lecrae even made plans to leave Reach Records and to walk away from music entirely. And what Lecrae did next caught everyone off guard. He didn't walk away, but stopped everything, left Columbia Records, stepped off the stage for a while, and for the first time in his entire career, let himself face what he'd been carrying around since he was a child. He started therapy, traveled to Israel to get rebaptized, and began sitting with things he'd spent 15 years wrapping around but never directly confronting. The abuse, the father who was never there, the depression, the PTSD, and the quiet question that had been following him around longer than any of it, whether what he believed was actually real or whether he had just traded one way of living for another. And in 2020, after all of that rustling, he came back with something that felt less like a music release, but more like a public confession. Lecrae released Restoration, paired with a book called I Am Restored, How I Lost My Religion But Found My Faith, that ended up finding an audience he never anticipated. People who had been sitting in church their whole lives with questions that they wanted answered, but were too afraid to ask. People who loved God, but had been quietly devastated by the institution around them. When people talk about Lecrae, the conversation usually starts with the chart records or the Grammys. 4 Grammy wins, over 3 million albums sold, a platinum single with Tori Kelly, a New York Times bestseller book, and a label that Lecrae built completely from scratch that shaped an entire generation of Christian hip-hop. But what actually separates Lecrae from everyone else in his lane is that Lecrae kept being himself when being himself cost him something. Lecrae didn't do a rebrand, and he didn't run back to what was easy. He sat in the hardest part of his own story and made music out of it anyway. In 2025, Lecrae dropped Reconstruction, Lecrae's 10th studio album featuring Killer Mike and T.I. Over 20 years in the game, and Lecrae is still building. If you enjoyed learning about Lecrae's story, hit that subscribe button and let us know which artists we should cover next. Thank you so much for watching, and stay blessed.